Welcome back to App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Copilot, Jam, and Tailscale. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. You know, in the pre-show today, we talked all about a new research system that I've come up with that's based on a dual display setup with a device that I will be reviewing eventually on Mac Stories. But if you're the kind of person who's into research, reading, taking notes, highlighting, and doing so efficiently, pre-show's for you.
Yeah. A very cool look at John's workflow for the big story that he did about the DOJ versus Apple case, which is also what we're going to talk about today. You published an excellent overview on Mac Stories, 4,000 plus, I believe, word overview of the complaint from the Department of Justice in the United States against Apple. And there was a lot of detail in the story, but I figured we could still talk about it to sort of explain a little bit more in depth what exactly is antitrust law in the United States, why is it tricky, and really the thing I also want to discuss with you is the fundamental difference between the approach that we have seen in the EU, where the strategy was to pass new regulations, versus the United States, where the approach was to file a lawsuit against Apple, which I think is also kind of emblematic of the United States as a country. You know,
it is, and I think
you guys love your lawsuits. That's for sure.
And I think the Europeans like their regulations, so I think it's pretty fitting for both regions. So. Yeah, we should talk about all this, but that pre-show, Federico, if people are interested, they need to go to appstories.plus to subscribe to App Stories Plus, or join Club Premier by going to plus.club to learn more about all the things we offer at Club Mac Stories, including App Stories Plus if you're a Club Premier member. All right, I'll leave the pitches at that for today, Federico, because we have a lot of ground to cover. What would you like to know? Where should we start? Should we start with the Sherman Act? I had fun with this.
I was going to ask you, what's that image? What's that reference? It must be one of those like American cultural references that I don't understand.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of, I would say it's a bit of a boomer reference too, because this is from a cartoon from the late 60s and early 70s called Rocky and Bullwinkle. And there were two characters named Sherman and Mr. Peabody. And Mr. Peabody is the dog with the glasses who is kind of a genius. And Sherman was kind of like his human sidekick. And
Sherman and Mr. Peabody. Okay.
Yes. And I came up with this idea after having spent way too much time reading about the Sherman Antitrust Act, and also struggling to think, how am I going to illustrate this article? Because you know what? Right. Nobody wants to be faced with a wall of 4,000 words. They just don't. And so I kind of took a page out of The Verge's playbook with the hero image, and I made that out of SF symbols and an SVG of the Department of Justice's seal that I found online. And then in Pixelmator Pro, that's the behind the scenes. And then I found this Sherman, this guy, the little cartoon Sherman guy, because I had to come up with something in the Sherman Act section. And between that and a picture of the original law, which I used because I wanted to give people a sense for what's going on here. We are applying a law that was enacted in 1890.
Okay. This is where I want to start.
To a tech company.
So first of all, do you know what, like, why is it called antitrust and not like anti-competition or something? Like, what's the trust?
Yes, that is very old terminology. And the people who originally were breaking up railroads and oil companies and things, you know, during the I guess you would call them the robber baron heyday of the late 1800s in the United States, they were called trust busters. And I'm not sure.
Trust busters?
They were. And I don't know, I'd have to look into this more carefully, but I'm not sure if the trust was a form of legal entity back then that a lot of these conglomerates used, or if that was just kind of more of a term of art from the period. But yes, that's kind of where antitrust comes, because they were busting up these trusts that were, you know, things like railroads. And railroads are like kind of the quintessential monopoly, because, you know, if I have a railroad that goes between Chicago and New York, it doesn't make any sense for you to also lay tracks right next to mine. You end up with a situation where one person owns the only way to move freight from one city to another,
Right.
and that is a monopoly, because there's no one else who can really own those tracks. And then because that's the case, they can charge whatever they want to anybody who wants to ship freight. And that was a really big problem as the US was expanding west and the railroads were expanding into the western United States, and where this law came from. And Sherman happened to be the person who came up with the law. That's where the name Sherman comes from.
Okay. So we are applying this very old law to a company that makes cutting edge tech.
Yes, and I think one of the things that people have to keep in mind with all of this is that isn't a great approach, and it's not a great approach, I don't think, because these kind of companies weren't really envisioned in the 1890s, obviously. And the business models that apply to tech companies are very different than kind of like the physical products world that we've dealt with, whether it's railroads or AT&T with their telephone lines running into people's homes. It's just a different business model that doesn't fit neatly into a lot of the existing case law that defines what a monopoly is. But because monopoly is also a very fluid term, it's not really defined outright in the Sherman Act. It can be change over time. What is a monopoly can change as the courts interpret the law, but I don't think it's the best way. Personally, I think the regulation route is better, what the EU is doing, but I don't see that as being something that's really practical in the United States right now, because Congress is very divided, at least especially in the House of Representatives, and they've had a very difficult time right now passing any kind of major legislation.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask you. Like,
Yeah.
why is it that you're relying on this very old law about railroad tracks instead of passing a new law? And it seems like that the issue is that it's like at the very core of the situation, it's very difficult to pass new laws in the United States right now. So that's why you're relying on the old ones.
Right. And it's been like that for a while now. And so, this is really, I think that there's a whole political, overlay to what's going on here, I think, too, which it's pretty popular thing to dump on tech companies right now.
Yes.
Politically,
like
regardless
the anti-big tech.
Yeah,
sentiment.
kind of regardless of what your political views are. It's a little bit of a unifying topic for politicians right now. And so I think that this is like that's part of what's going on here. But we should probably just focus really on what Apple's been accused of and whether or not the DOJ's arguments are any good. And I think, a lot of them aren't that great. There's some good arguments here, but and I guess one other thing I would say before we get too deep into the weeds is that one of the things I see online a lot is that people hang all of their hopes and dreams on things like the EU's regulations and this DOJ lawsuit, which I think I would caution people against doing, because there's a big difference between what's legal and what's right. And you can disagree with some of Apple's approaches to how they treat developers, how they deal with features and deal with their customers, and it could still be legal. And that's an unfortunate, I mean, that I don't know if it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So just because I'm going to tell you that a lot of these are very bad arguments doesn't mean that I agree that Apple has always been in the right on a lot of these issues. It's just that what the judge is going to be asked to do is to apply what Apple did to the Sherman antitrust law and all the case law that has been decided under it. And it's going to be an uphill battle for them, I think. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Copilot. I've been using Copilot for over a year, and the reason that I've stuck with it for monitoring my finances is that it takes no effort at all. but provides so many valuable insights. That's been critical to staying on top of my spending because when I'm busy, I can still find a minute or two to check on my latest purchases, make any adjustments, and then keep my spending under control by monitoring my overall financial health. Its native iPhone and Mac apps can do it all. They can track your spending, your budget, investments, your net worth, all in one place, allowing you to drill into the details without losing sight of the big picture. The secret of Copilot is really how easy it is to use. The app connects securely to your bank and other financial accounts and then reports back whenever it detects a new transaction. New transactions are listed in Copilot's dashboard, which analyzes and suggests categories for each. That makes reviewing transactions and applying them to your budget simple. With just a few taps or clicks, you can review everything and update your spending. Copilot's dashboard is your one-stop destination to get an overview of your finances, including your recent spending, where you stand on your budget, upcoming recurring expenses, income, and more. For a more detailed look at your finances, though, Copilot includes a detailed categories tab, more information on recurring expenses like subscriptions, a chronological list of every transaction, and it can track the performance of your investments and the balance of each of your accounts, whether it's a bank account, investment account, credit card, or something else. Plus, with a recent update, Copilot is among the very first apps that can track the Apple Card and its transactions too. If you've ever struggled with tracking your finances, give Copilot a try today. You can visit their website at copilot.money to learn more and sign up. And listeners of this show can get an extra month on their free trial. So instead of 1 month, you get 2 months for free just by using the code MACStories when you sign up. Again, go to copilot.money to learn more and use that code MACStories when you sign up to try Copilot. Our thanks to Copilot for their support of the show.
And before we get to the allegations, which I want to understand from you, let me ask you this. One of the things I've heard over the past week or so is that, we're gonna get so many interesting details about this case because a lot of emails will be sort of unearthed from inside Apple, and we're gonna have a chance to read communication between Apple executives. Now, help me understand this stuff, because this happens every single time there's a lawsuit. Like, when it was like Apple versus Samsung, we had the emails from Apple executives, about Android and Samsung. Like, how do these things physically happen? Like, a judge, or somebody goes to Apple and says, let me search in your email database for communicate. Like, how is that actually what happens?
Yeah. I mean, the way it works, it's called discovery.
Like, somebody goes there and types in a search field and looks at the emails.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a logistical standpoint, what's done these days, this is one of those areas that AI is being brought to bear on. But what will happen is both sides have an opportunity to do what is called discovery, where the DOJ has obviously done some amount of investigation leading up to filing a complaint, but they haven't looked at all of Apple's records or interviewed all the employees they want to. So they're going to be gathering evidence to support their case. Right?
So the employee interviews, I understand. Like, you want to use them as witnesses or of sorts, I guess.
Yep.
And like, you want to interview them and you want to get them on the record. But what about the emails? Like,
well,
how
the
does
email,
it work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things they're trying to determine here is whether Apple acted in an unfair and anti-competitive way.
Right.
And so one bit of evidence of that would be if there was an email that said, we have to do this because if we don't, the competition is going to eat our lunch, something like that.
Yeah.
And so that's why you go digging through the email. And this is an incredibly expensive, time-consuming project because you can only imagine how much email there is at Apple, right?
Right.
And so it'll be pinpointed. They'll have to narrow down their requests to cover only certain topics. Then Apple's lawyers will go through Apple's email, basically, and they will turn over the email to the DOJ, who will then have to go through it and read it all. And then they will say, you didn't do a good enough job. We think that there are these other emails that you should give us too, based on what they see. And then Apple's lawyers will have to go back, dig through the email some more. And they'll be asking for a lot more than email. Email's a big part of it, but they'll probably want Slack logs. They'll probably want memos and other documents, spreadsheets, financial analysis that Luca has created. All that kind of stuff.
So even if the DOJ loses this lawsuit, this will still be kind of bad for Apple in terms of surfacing in the public all of these internal communications.
Yes, although they'll have an opportunity to ask that some of it be kept private. I mean, I think what happens what happens in these cases, though, is that this is where you find lawyers who aren't good at redacting things, and then techies who are able to go in and look underneath the redaction and see what has been taken out, or things will get leaked by someone who's tangentially involved in the case, like maybe at the courthouse, or
because there's other people who see this stuff. So when these leaks happen, right, I see.
Right, and now not everything that's going to be discovered is going to be filed with the court. It doesn't work that way, but there will be at times things that are submitted to the court because they're going to use them in court, and so the judge has to see them at some point, and that's a much smaller universe of things than what the DOJ will be looking at. But, there are a lot of people involved in this process, between the lawyers on both sides, all the people helping them go through all this stuff. There's a lot of opportunities for things to kind of slip through the cracks, intentionally or unintentionally, really. And Apple will have to ask the judge, if it wants to keep stuff private, if they can do so. And the judge may say yes, the judge may say no. I mean, a lot of it will be kept private, but there will be things that a lot of what you'll find comes out in court will be the most damaging stuff, because that's what the DOJ is trying to prove. They're trying to prove that Apple acted in a bad way. So they'll cherry pick stuff that they think shows that Apple was acting in an anti-competitive way. So yeah, that's the whole discovery process. And that is going to cost Apple millions of dollars.
Okay. And help me understand a few more details here. You mentioned it's an incredibly time-consuming process. How time-consuming and why is it expensive? And the second question is, just to sort of clarify this, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is a branch of the U.S. government, right?
It is.
So it's so it's like if the Ministry of Defense in Italy sues someone, it's the Italian government.
Okay. Yeah, it is the government. And I read, while I was doing this research, that not long after Joe Biden was elected president, the DOJ got an increase in its budget of $50 million for antitrust enforcement.
That's going to help.
So they've got a little bit of a kitty. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Apple's lawyers burned through $50 million in a single month on this case, if not more. This is a case that is going to cost Apple in the 9 figures easily. I suspect.
So wait, 9 figures? That would be billions?
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions. Oh man!
Because look, the top lawyers on this case probably are billed out at somewhere in the range of $1,000 to $1,500 an hour.
And now paying a fine in the EU doesn't look so bad.
Yeah, and there will be legions of junior lawyers and paralegals and other people helping out with this discovery. It's just a person-intensive process. Now, as I said, it's been a long time since I've been involved in that kind of litigation, and it's changed. A lot more is computer-driven now. And algorithms look for search terms and other things that raise questions about what's been turned over. So there were times in my career where I would literally go through boxes of email, reading every single email.
Oh my God.
That'll make your eyes bleed.
Oh my. You literally did that. You went through boxes of printed emails.
Yeah, on paper. On paper.
Oh my. Okay, so all right. So that being said, thank you for contextualizing what this process looks like.
Yeah. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Jam. If you're a web developer and you work on a team, you'll know that sometimes your teammates send you bug reports with very little context. like maybe a text description with no screenshot, console logs, or user ID. And instead of fixing it, you have to go to the person who made the ticket and hunt down the right information, or go back and forth over weeks in ticket comments to find out if it was a local storage API, the response to a network request, cookies at the time zone you're in. And it just ends up being really frustrating trying to figure out exactly what went wrong. You might have heard of Jam. It's used by more than 90,000 people. That's because it's a free tool that saves web developers and designers a ton of time and frustration. It ensures that your teammates make the perfect bug report every time. They literally can't do it wrong. It automatically includes a video of the bug, console logs, network requests, and the information you'll need to debug, like even what their internet speed was. It even automatically lists the steps to reproduce the bug. It's super easy to get your teammates to use Jam because it's just a Chrome extension. When they see a bug, they just click the button and right away it creates a ticket in your issue tracker. So it saves time for them and it saves you a lot of hopping on calls and meetings to debug. If you're a web developer and you would rather spend your time writing code than responding to comments in your issue tracker, send your team jam.dev. That's jam.dev, or just use the link in the show notes. Our thanks to Jam for their support of the show.
What are the allegations?
So the allegations are that Apple became at some point in the past a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And once they became a monopoly, their conduct was illegal because it was anti-competitive, and that they caused economic damage to users, consumers of their products, as well as developers. That's kind of broad brush what's happening here. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is like, it's not illegal to be competitive with your rivals. And the problem is that if you cross into that territory of being a monopoly at some point, some of the things you may have been, perfectly legal in the past no longer are. And that is the first thing that is going to have to be decided here. Was Apple a monopoly, or is it currently a monopoly? And when did that happen? And that's why one of the things that's very important right off the bat is to figure out what is the market here, because
and also I think it goes without saying, but we're all starting from the assumption that monopolies are bad, right? And right. I say this because there is maybe an undercurrent of some Apple fans who may be thinking, well, are monopolies actually bad?
That's a very good point, because I have heard the argument that, the monopoly is good because it means that Apple's providing all this great quality integrated
I've
service.
seen those replies from certain folks on Mastodon, for example.
Yeah.
And monopolies are bad. Monopolies are bad.
There's a kernel of truth, but that's like saying that having a dictator run your country is good because nobody's exactly. there to argue with them and they get things done. Not to get too political here, but there is, and I'm sure there is in Italy, there is in other European countries, there is always an undercurrent of a thankfully very, very, very small and useless minority of people who are like, well, when we were a dictatorship before we were a republic, things got done. Right. There is always that group of people in Italy. I'm sure there is in Germany. I'm sure there is in Spain. But none of that matters, because thankfully, as a society, we know that obviously living under dictatorship is not good. Yeah. And I think obviously it's much less severe when it comes to a monopoly about phones, but right. But there is that minority who's like, well, I actually like being inside of a monopoly because at least things get done from Apple. Right. And look, it's a very similar argument. It's the benevolent dictatorship argument. And I don't buy it. The thing about monopolies, the reason monopolies are illegal is because if you're a monopoly, you can charge people whatever price you want.
Yep.
That's what the railroads were all about, because, the person who owned the tracks could charge whatever they wanted because someone had to get their stuff from point A to point B. That's one thing. But it also has other kinds of strange economic consequences, because once you have a monopoly and you're able to get those nice juicy profits, you want to protect that monopoly. And when you protect that monopoly, you start doing things to undermine your competitors. It often creates all kinds of skewed incentives in terms of the quality of the products, and innovation tends to slow down because there's no need to innovate if you don't have to compete against anybody. That's kind of why it's bad. And that, I think, at the heart of it is why antitrust is such a very, I guess, storied thing in American history, is that I think it's very true that a lot of Americans believe very strongly in innovation and competition and capitalism, and monopoly cuts against all of those things.
Right. And historically, companies that were deemed monopolies in the United States, AT&T, right,
Yep.
was one, like the phone company. And was there also there like American Tobacco or something?
Yes, American Tobacco, and like I said, some railroads in the long ago past.
Okay. So again, starting from the assumption we're all in agreement that monopolies are bad. So the DOJ is arguing Apple became a monopoly at some point, and because of that, their behavior changed. What I want to understand with you is how the DOJ is sort of classifying, like categorizing the monopoly, because they are saying they became a monopoly either in the smartphone market or in the performance smartphone. What does that like? Is this normal to have an either or?
It is.
Okay.
Because, I mean, look, you're the DOJ, you want to win. And if you want to win,
of course,
you can argue in the alternative, which is it's bad because of either this reason or that reason. And the fact that they're arguing in the alternative between these two different markets shows that they're not 100% confident in arguing that Apple is a monopoly in the entire smartphone market. And why is that? Well, because Apple's got roughly, by some measures, around 65% of the US smartphone market. But when you look at it globally, they've only got about 23%. And so there's a lot of questions here that have to be answered. It's like, well, is the US market the right market to look at, or is it the global market? And also, is it all cell phones? I mean, does that include, dumb flip phones? Does it include, I don't know, the jitterbug that they market to elderly people? Does it include, like the few candy bar cell phones that are feature phones that are still out there? I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. That the judge is going to be given testimony by expert economist witnesses who will say what they think the market is, and undoubtedly the witnesses for the DOJ will say it's as small a market as possible, because that means Apple will occupy the biggest percentage possible, and Apple will say that it's the global smartphone market, period, and that they only have 23%. And even where the case was filed shows you why this is such an important issue, because the U.S. District Court for New Jersey, which is where this case was filed, is in the Third Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals in the U.S. And the Third Circuit has said that there can be a monopoly with as low as 55% of the market. That's very good for the DOJ.
That's convenient.
Yeah. So yeah, it's that's where we stand. And I'm not going to tell you what I think the answer is. I don't think. The problem is, this is a very hard question, and I'm not an economist. I'm not sure what the answer is here. And anybody that tells you otherwise, I think, is probably just kind of making it up. I mean, I can make it up too. It seems to me that measuring by the U.S. market, because this is a U.S. company and a U.S. law, makes sense. Whether there is such a thing as a performance smartphone market, I really don't know. I'm pretty skeptical about it, but I want to hear what smarter people about this kind of stuff have to say about it than me. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Tailscale. Human scale teams build trusted networks by securely connecting devices with Tailscale. With Tailscale, you can connect to Home Assistant to check on your place while you're away. You can also stream movies, shows, and music anywhere from your network-attached storage using Plex or Jellyfin. Plus, you can access a Pi-hole from anywhere and secure your connection when you're on Wi-Fi that you don't totally trust. And you can now sign in to Tailscale using your Apple ID. So if you prefer having your credentials managed by Apple and iCloud, that's an option for you. Just sign into Tailscale with your Apple ID on your Mac or iPhone using Touch ID or Face ID for super fast sign-in. Plus, you can also use a passkey to authenticate your Tailscale account, a new feature that you may remember seeing at WWDC. Once connected, you can use TailDrop to move files between a MacBook, an iPhone, an iPad, a Linux VM, Docker containers, a Steam Deck, and even Windows boxes. There are a lot of options. I use this feature all the time. If you're looking to share your work more widely, Tailscale Funnel makes it easier than ever to share your local development over the internet for collaboration, testing, and experimentation. Using Tailscale Funnel, you can receive a webhook from GitHub, share a local service with your coworker, or even host a personal blog or status page on your own computer. Funnel is a secure way to expose your development environment at a stable URL over the internet, complete with auto-provision TLS certificates. Use it from the command line or the new VS Code extension. With a few keystrokes, you can securely expose a local port to the internet right from the IDE. Tailscale has clients for macOS and iOS, Windows, Linux, and Android. The free plan includes 3 users and 100 devices. Head on over to tailscale.com/appstories to build your team's trusted network today. That's tailscale.com/appstories. And if you're interested in working at Tailscale, they're currently hiring a macOS engineer. You can navigate to their careers page for more. Our thanks to Tailscale for their support of the show.
I want to talk about something like the consequences of this lawsuit, and in parallel also what's happening in Europe.
Yeah.
Because even if this like the DMA is still like it's in effect, but it's an ongoing process in
Right.
terms of Apple adapting to the DMA. And here this lawsuit that was just filed, and Apple needs to respond, and then it needs to go to a judge, and it's a whole process, and you said it's going to take years. But so let's say you're Apple, right? And in the meantime, you still got to run your business, right? You still need to design the next operating systems and plan ahead for the next and the next after next version of the operating system. And you also need to make hardware.
Yep.
So, but you have these lawsuits on your mind. And so I have to wonder if the thought of what's happening in the US and Europe will affect right now software design, especially because I think if you're Apple and you're thinking, well, we're under scrutiny here, and I guess not even any more scrutiny, like we literally got sued in the US and we need to follow these new regulations in the EU. Maybe the way that we think about the software that we make in the meantime needs to change. And so I kind of wonder if maybe the Apple that we will see going forward will be a more, I kind of want to say, API driven company, in the sense that it seems to me like a pretty easy way to counter these arguments would be to say, well, look, we make our services, we make our hardware, but we also make all these APIs that let other companies take advantage of our hardware and offer software that is comparable to ours. And so I have to wonder, and maybe an example of this is the Journal app, right? The Journal app, brand new, and mind you, sure, it's a very small example, but it's got a tiny bit of what I mean in it, which is it is a brand new Apple experience, but it was also launched. It was introduced with an API for third-party journal apps to say we can also take advantage of this. And so I have to wonder if with this lawsuit ongoing and the DMA in effect in Europe and maybe other governments around the world sort of looking at Apple and being like, is there anything that we can do here? I kind of wonder if that will change how Apple makes software in the near term.
I think it will. I mean, I think we've already seen, there have been changes. I mean, obviously there are forced changes in Europe, but along with those forced changes in Europe, we got changes in the United States and around the world for things like video game streaming, which I suspect was driven by what Apple knew was coming down the road with the DOJ. And so it is going to influence how they make their products. I think in some respects, it will potentially influence them for the better. Something like Journal might be an example where the API came out day and date with the Journal app, and that's a good thing because it allows those other journaling apps to compete with Apple head to head right away. But I also feel like this is going to be, and we saw this with Microsoft when it was sued in the late 90s, it's going to be a major distraction and could make them gun shy about innovating on certain things. So
that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point.
So I think it's a mixed bag. I think, you can applaud governments around the world for having pushed Apple to do the right thing, if it's something that you agree with. On the other hand, this lawsuit is going to be a major distraction for a lot of people working at Apple, whether it's the engineer who has to come up with 5 years of email for lawyers, or whether it's Tim Cook who's getting deposed. So, it is a potential distraction. It's not a universally good or bad thing, is how I would put it.
But there is also the optimistic point of view, which maybe this will sound controversial, but I think the optimistic point of view would be that this lawsuit is actually good for Apple, because regardless of the outcome, it will force them to think, to go back to competing with other services and companies on the grounds of great design, great product design, whether it's software or hardware, instead of private APIs and limitations. I think what a lot of people loved about the Apple from the late 90s and the early 2000s, the whole Steve Jobs era. Obviously, it was the Steve Jobs character that people loved, but also people love an underdog, and people loved, I think, the Apple that obviously was not a monopoly, and arguably, I don't think it's a monopoly, but there are some things that have been anti-competitive, so I don't really know what my opinion is. But I think what was true back then was that Apple was winning the hearts and minds of people because they offered better design of literally any other alternative.
Right.
And so maybe in a way, this lawsuit will force them to think, well, we don't have that shortcut anymore in terms of offering experiences that other companies cannot build on our platforms, because our platforms got so huge over the past decade. So we want people to choose us because we make the best experiences, not the exclusive experiences, but the best ones in terms of quality and design.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I mean, I guess I would point out a couple of things in response to that. One is, I think that Apple's history, their underdog history, has worked against them, because I think that the people running Apple, many of whom were around then, still have that mindset.
Yeah.
And that kind of scrappy mindset works when you actually are the underdog and you are fighting for your life. When those same tactics are applied when you're a $1 trillion company, it's not a good look. And that's where where they are today. That's the problem. One of the problems. I've always felt that the near-death experience where they nearly filed bankruptcy was a very good thing for Apple until it wasn't. And the point at which it wasn't was when anybody could look at Apple and say, well, you're not so much the scrappy underdog anymore. Now you're the giant multinational corporation that can kind of force things down our throats. And this behavior is not as acceptable in those circumstances. So that's one thing. The other is, I spent way too many years doing big litigation, Federico, and I am very cynical about it. I don't think it's good for anybody. I don't think it's good for Apple. I don't think it's good for their users. I don't think it's good for the developers. Ultimately, I think everybody's going to lose a little bit when it comes to both the lawsuit and a lot of the regulations out there, because now we have lawyers and government officials determining the features of Apple products by committee. And That's not great. I mean, that's in a way, that's where that kind of benevolent dictatorship argument comes from. It's like, well, I don't want the government telling me what my iPhone can do. I want Apple to tell me because they're better at it. And you know what? They are better at it. But the problem is that Apple has gotten themselves into this pickle because of their behavior. And that's why we are where we are. And so there's no good way out of it other than changing the behavior and trying to settle with the US government and the European Commission and all that and working something out. But lawsuits, they're just expensive distractions, and that's money that should be spent on something more productive than a bunch of arguments between lawyers in a courtroom.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an interesting problem, right? When the thing you make becomes so successful that you cannot make the rules for it alone anymore.
Right.
Like when the product you make as an upstart, as the underdog, becomes and reshapes society and creates jobs,
You lose control of it,
you lose
basically.
control of. Like, I think it's such an interesting problem because I
It
see
is.
and in the past I personally have had this thought of like, why can't you just leave Apple alone? And I mean, they make the phone, it's their product.
Right.
They should be entitled to decide what they want to make of it. But then it becomes a bigger problem when you realize, well, it's not just a product in isolation. You cannot consider the product in a vacuum, right? It's the product that has also created an industry, and there's people who have jobs because of it. There's people who pay taxes because of those jobs, right? It has this ripple effect, right, on society,
on the economy, on culture, on everything.
Yeah. And so it's not just a phone. It's a part of society, and when it comes to society, the only tool that we have is in a functioning democracy is the law. And
Right.
so and I think it's this very fascinating problem that I don't have an answer, you don't have an answer for. And yeah, I guess you're right, it'll be an expensive distraction, and who knows if it will lead to anything in a few years. That's the thing, like this will go on.
And we should talk just very briefly as we close this out about what's likely to happen. People talk about breaking up Apple. I really don't see that happening. AT&T got broken up. The DOJ
When you say got broken up, so this means like sort of like breaking up the company into multiple companies?
Right. So you would have the hardware manufacturer, and then you'd have an OS company, a services company, that kind
Okay.
of stuff. You'd break them all up, and maybe they would have deals with each other, but they would be separate companies. And the DOJ got an order to do that to Microsoft, but it got overturned on appeal.
Huh.
And AT&T itself actually was broken up and then essentially got put back together over decades that followed after the 80s. And so given what's happened here, I don't really see that as being a realistic outcome. I think more likely is what you'll see is the judge craft some kind of remedy that is not unlike what the European Commission is doing as part of the DMA. It's just coming at it from a different perspective, from the perspective of the courts. It would be something like, you're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z, and you're going to have to pay these penalties. I mean, sounds familiar, right? The DMA, the EU can levy penalties against Apple, and they've made a bunch of rules about what they can and can't do. It's just that in the United States, it's more likely that a judge is going to do that.
And so you think, once again, this process will take years, and in the meantime, like, will there be like, what's the next near term event like that Apple is going to respond?
Yes, they have
Okay.
60 days under federal law to file an answer, and that could be extended. We don't know, but then there'll be a long period of discovery, depositions, all that stuff, and there'll be motions to throw out parts of the DOJ's complaint, and eventually, once all that kind of happens, they'll set a trial schedule, and there'll be a trial in front of a judge.
All right. Well, we'll follow along, of course, and we'll have our expert John.
Yes, I will do my best. I am not really an antitrust expert, but funnily enough, the very first thing I wrote that was published was an article on antitrust law, a different antitrust law in law school, because I do really find antitrust fascinating because of the economics underlying it. And I did study it a fair amount in school. It's just that wasn't what I practiced as a lawyer. So, all right, Federico. Well, good conversation. I'm sure we'll be talking about this again at some point. I want to thank our three sponsors again. That's Copilot, Jam, and Tailscale. You can find the two of us at macstories.net. Federico and I are on Mastodon. Just go to vitici.macstories.net and johnvorhees.macstories.net to find us there. And we're on Threads and Instagram. Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.